Mobile Suit Gundam is one of the biggest anime in the world. In fact, it's actually one of the highest grossing franchises in the world just in general. However, despite it being such a big cultural cornerstone, many of these self-proclaimed anime fans have actually not ever seen a Gundam show, and I think that's just because the franchise has gotten so big since its debut that maybe it's a little daunting for newcomers to get into. So, if you've been wanting to get into Gundam but don't know where to start, or maybe you actually have seen a Gundam show before and you just want a little refresher, then this video's for you. Now, one of the first things you should know about the Gundam franchise is that in addition to it being very large, there's also a lot of variation within it. And by variation, I mean it varies greatly in terms of its quality. Not all the shows and movies even take place within the same continuity, and I will move on to explaining each of the continuities soon. Trust me, but just let me get this out of the way first, please. And then, in addition, they don't even all take place, they don't even fall under the same genre, but for the most part, most Gundam shows will fall under what is called the real robot genre. And to understand the real robot genre, you have to realize that Gundam originally, when it first came out, the Mobile Suit Gundam in 1979, it invented the real robot genre by being a deconstruction of the mecha genre up to that point. And the mecha genre up to that point is what we now refer to as the super robot genre, and the super robot genre pretty much treated robots more like these big superheroes rather than actual vehicles per se. So that's what we mean when we say real robot versus super robot. So if not all Gundam media belongs to the same genre, you might be wondering, what are the common elements between them all? What makes a Gundam show outside of the legality of the name? Well, at the bare minimum, at the very least, each piece of Gundam media includes things called mobile suits, or mobile suits, or MSs. And a mobile suit is just the general term, the general name for the pilotable mechs in these universes. Now, a Gundam is a super special kind of mobile suit, and the actual definition of what makes a Gundam varies depending on continuity. Now that you know how loosely binding a Gundam title is, I will move on to explaining the different continuities. Okay, so, one of the nice things about there being multiple continuities is that it means there are actually several good entry points. For example, my introduction to the franchise was this super obscure title called SD Gundam Force. It was this sort of this one-time spin-off type thing, which was actually to commemorate one of Gundam's big anniversary years, so it's chock full of a lot of self-referential stuff. For example, the main character, or the main Gundam here, he has a whole bunch of motifs and abilities that each belonged individually to different Gundams in different Gundam shows, but they sort of combined them into one character here, so he's just a walking combination of references. And the SD, if you're familiar with anime or anime culture, you'll know that SD typically is an acronym for Super Deformed, which is a rough translation of chibi, which is like a little cutesy art style, which is what this is. As you can see, the proportions are kind of strange here, not what you might have seen if you saw a Gundam in something else. But anyways, a great way to make myself look like I don't know what I'm talking about immediately, a great way to hurt my credibility immediately, is that I literally just finished saying that the one unifying factor between all Gundam media is that they all had mobile suits, which were pilotable mechs. However, this, in SD Gundam Force, oh, by the way, SD, it's a meta thing, because even though, you know, we would know SD stands for Super Deformed, in universe it actually stands for Superior Defender, so the whole title is Superior Defender Gundam Force, so that's what this is if you want to look it up. But anyways, in universe, they're actually not pilotable mechs, but all mobile suits in this are fully autonomous robots, and so it actually has more of a Mega Man vibe than anything, which I actually kind of like, but yeah, that's weird. My point is that there are many good Gundam shows that can serve as an introduction. However, my role here is to show you what each one is kind of about. So I'm going to move through the continuities, like I said, but as I go through the different continuities and talk about each show, I'm going to sort of explain each one's selling points, so that way you can sort of have an idea on if you'd like it or not, because with how much variation there is, it's very unlikely that any one person would like every piece of Gundam media. I definitely do not like all the Gundam shows, and I will let you know which ones I don't like. So, moving on, the first continuity I want to talk about is also the most notable one and also the biggest one, and that's because it is the one that started with the original Mobile Suit Gundam, which released in 1979. Focus. I have a lot of the Blu-rays for these, so I'm going to use them as visual aids as I go through. Keep in mind, though, that if you want to buy any of these, for a lot of these shows with lots of episodes, if you want to get every episode, you'll have to buy them as part 1 and part 2, so just keep that in mind if you go shopping. But anyways, the main continuity is referred to as the Universal Century Timeline, as it started with the original Gundam when it released in 1979. The reason it's called the Universal Century Timeline is that in universe, when humans started living in space colonies, they rebooted the calendar year, so it rebooted with the year 0, right? And so this takes place in the Universal Century year 0079. So it takes place 79 years after humans officially started living in space. So sometimes, to avoid confusion, you'll hear Mobile Suit Gundam, the original, referred to as Gundam 0079, conveniently. So honestly, if you want my general recommendation, this is what I will recommend to you if you are serious about watching Gundam. If you are serious about it and you want to start watching through them and you want to get if you want to get a real appreciation of what the show's about, I recommend starting with this just because it's the original. I know this is kind of an easy answer with this being the first in the franchise and all, but if you want my brutally honest recommendation, this is what I recommend starting with if you're actually serious about getting into Gundam. Yes, the animation's very old. Some people will have a hard time getting over that, but I have a very high tolerance for that because I just really like seeing old stuff and appreciating where something came from. And after watching a few episodes, it doesn't even feel old to me anymore. Once I start watching a few episodes of this old animation, I start to kind of see it for just what it is, and I kind of feel like I'm somebody watching it as if I was actually there when it originally came out. So this is going to obviously vary a lot from person to person, but I definitely just tell you to give it a chance. There is a movie trilogy which condenses all of these episodes down into 3 movies. That might be kind of tempting for you if you find this kind of boring. However, I would just recommend not doing it that way because this is literally what started the whole franchise, and so why would you not want to see everything about it if this is literally what kickstarted the rest of this giant franchise, right? However, I have heard that the movie trilogy for this is actually decent because the pacing in this is not that great. The part in the middle, it gets kind of slow, and so the movie trilogy kind of cuts the fat and makes it more streamlined. And so I've actually heard from people that the movie trilogy is okay, but if you want my recommendation, just watch the whole thing, just watch the original. Not only should you start with Gundam 0079 to gain a very good understanding and appreciation of what the whole franchise is about, but also Gundam 0079 here bears witness to what is called the 1-Year War, and obviously it takes place over 1 year. You're a genius for getting that, by the way. But you are going to hear characters in the Universal Century or UC timeline constantly refer back to this 1-Year War, or depending on who you're asking, the Zeon War of Independence, because it had so many lasting consequences. More than half of the human population died during this war, and so it had so much aftermath and direct and indirect consequences. It's just such a huge event in this continuity's history that you need to be at least familiar with it. Also, with this, it introduces the rivalry between the main character Amuro Ray with Char Aznable, which is a huge player in the events to come, not only in this, but also several of the shows after it. And also, this will introduce the term new type, which is effectively a psychic empath, which is obviously super useful. And this whole Gundam's all about anti-war. It's about sending an anti-war message. And so one of the best ways you can send an anti-war message is by putting a high empath right in the middle of a giant war. You can pretty much get where that's going. Originally, I wanted to go through the Universal Century timeline in chronological order, naturally, but I kind of had to start with the original Gundam, right? So next up, the next show I want to talk about is Mobile Suit Gundam: The Origin. Hence the name, it is actually chronologically the first show in the Universal Century timeline. It's actually pretty new, so the animation's really, really good. But what's cool is that with the animation being really, really good, they also kept all of the same art style of the characters from the 70s. So it looks like a show from the 70s, even though the animation is really good, and it seamlessly leads into Gundam 0079. However, despite this being the first show in chronological order, I would actually advise you not to watch this before Gundam 0079, because there is a lot of dramatic irony that will go over your head if you're not already familiar with events that happen in Gundam 0079. So I would actually recommend you watch Gundam 0079 and then watch Gundam: The Origin. So now I will go back to Gundam 0079, and from here on out, I will be speaking purely in terms of chronological order. So after Gundam 0079, the next required viewing show, and by required viewing, I mean a show that you have to watch in order as I list it on the screen, and also one that you can't skip if you really want to understand the Universal Century timeline. So the next required viewing show would be Zeta Gundam. But before I get to Zeta Gundam, I want to bring up the non-required viewing shows. So also from here on out, as I'm speaking through these chronologically, I will point out if a show is considered required viewing or non-required viewing. So in between Gundam 0079 and Zeta Gundam is Mobile Suit Gundam: The 8th MS Team. And although this is non-required viewing, this is very good because this was made in the late 90s, and so it has that golden age animation. It looks very, very good. And this takes place during the 1 Year War, near the end of the 1 Year War. So watching this gives you some more context and gives you some more perspective on the scale of the war. And what's cool about the 8th MS Team is that, also with these non-required viewing shows, you can literally just watch this by itself without having watched the other things. So like I said, if you really are serious about getting into Gundam and you want to learn the UC timeline, you should start with the original Gundam, Gundam 0079. But if you just want to watch a Gundam show, then you can definitely start with this because it gives you enough information to kind of get what's going on. So the whole selling point of the 8th MS Team is that the main characters are just regular military people. The main characters work for the Earth Federation. I should have mentioned that earlier. Although the show makes you pretty sympathetic towards both sides, both towards the Earth Federation and Zeon, Earth Federation is typically framed as the good guy, and Zeon is typically framed as the bad guy, or the good guys and the bad guys. So in the 8th MS Team, the main cast is just regular Earth Federation soldiers, and it actually takes place on Earth. A lot of the fighting in Gundam 0079 takes place in space, but most of the fighting in this takes place on Earth in a jungle, and so it has very much this sort of Vietnam War kind of vibe. And so if you're kind of sick of kid main characters and you want an actual adult as a main character as the driving force of a show, then this is right up your alley. Another side story which takes place during the 1 Year War is Gundam Thunderbolt. Again, like the 8th MS Team, Gundam Thunderbolt's main character is an adult, and so if you don't like kid main characters, this could be for you. But Gundam Thunderbolt has very little in terms of story, so you can watch it by itself, and it is just pure action, and the animation is impeccable because it's actually pretty new, but all the animation was hand-drawn, and so it's actually the best possible animation ever. However, because the mobile suits in this started to get really crazy and advanced, they later retconned this into not taking place in the actual Universal Century timeline, but some alternate Universal Century timeline in which technology was advanced further by the year 0079. But either way, you can watch it by itself. And even so, with it being an alternate version of the Universal Century timeline, they still refer to wars by the same name and everything, so you can definitely still fit this into the Universal Century timeline in terms of keeping track of events. Also, this one's soundtrack is super jazzy, so if you like jazz, then give this one a watch and a listen. Now we are in the year 0080. It's pretty convenient that some of these titles literally just include the year in which they take place. So now when you see a number like this in a Gundam title, you'll know it means the year in which they take place. So this takes place 1 year after Gundam 0079, and this is Gundam 0080 War in the Pocket. This is an OVA series, so if you want to buy it, you only need to buy the one Blu-ray, as you can see here. So, as I said before, my recommendation for if somebody is really serious about getting into Gundam and they know they have enough free time on their hands to really dig into it, I recommend Gundam 0079. However, if you don't really have that kind of time to commit to a show, then this is definitely my recommendation. I think Gundam 0080 War in the Pocket is actually the best example of what Gundam's all about. I think this has the best anti-war message, and it's not too long, so you can kind of just treat it like an extra long movie. You can watch the whole thing in one evening. It does a very good job of making you sympathize with characters on both sides of the war. Just overall really good. The animation is great. The music is good. Like I said, this is the best example of what Gundam is, so I would say this is the face of what Gundam is. Be warned, the ending for this is really sad. The last side story I'm going to talk about leading up to Zeta Gundam is Gundam 0083 Stardust Memory. Can you guess the year in which this takes place? That's right, 0083. Great job. So, Gundam 0083 Stardust Memory is definitely not my favorite. I don't think it's that great. It's not bad either. I just don't really like it that much because of how the main character is. The main character is pretty weak, and so that makes it not too great, but the animation is really, really good, and it has one of the best openings, and by openings, I don't mean necessarily the first episode. I mean the opening that plays at the beginning of each episode. Also, it's pretty short, but what's kind of nice about it is that it transitions pretty nicely into Zeta Gundam, and so it's really cool seeing the transition of powers at the end of 0083, which directly lead into Zeta Gundam and kick off the events in Zeta Gundam. So if you know you're going to watch Zeta Gundam anyway, you might as well watch this right before and then see how it goes into Zeta Gundam, because if you just go from Gundam 0079 to Zeta Gundam, you're going to have to fill in a little bit of the gaps yourself, but not that much. As I foreshadowed, we are now going to talk about Zeta Gundam, and just to reiterate, before I start talking about Zeta Gundam, I want to make myself clear. Gundam 0079 and Zeta Gundam are the first two of my so-called required viewings. These are the first two core shows in the Universal Century timeline. So if you try watching this before watching Gundam 0079, you will have no idea what's going on. But as for the side stories, which took place in between 0079 and this, so the 8th MS team, Gundam Thunderbolt, 0080, 0083, those you can watch in any order you want, and you don't even have to watch all of them if you want to start watching this. But at the bare minimum, you need to watch 0079. So far, I'm just keeping track of the core shows we have. It is 0079 and now this. So put simply, Zeta Gundam is Tomino's best work. This is the Universal Century timeline at its best. It's really dark, kind of depressing, and at this point, it is honestly kind of easy and interesting to track Tomino's mental health by watching his shows. I should have mentioned earlier, Tomino is the guy who made Gundam, he's the guy who made the original Gundam, and this is his second work. So from here on out, I'm going to mention if it's something that Tomino made. because, like I said, you can track his mental health. The reason why this is so dark and depressing is because at this point in his life when he was making this, he was in a super depressed state, and it definitely shows. So this might be a little too dark for everyone. It's not gory or anything. It's very depressing. And once again, it does a very good job of sending an anti-war message. What's interesting, though, is that Gundam 0079 was all about this huge, giant, large-scale war that takes out the majority of the population, right? Zeta Gundam here is much more smaller scale. The stakes are still really dire and serious. However, it's more like a bunch of guerrilla warfare. A lot of espionage, that kind of thing. So it's really, really cool. Once this gets going, you'll see why this is the best show in the Universal Century timeline. I have to warn you, though, that you might be tempted to watch the Zeta Gundam movie trilogy. Like Gundam 0079, Zeta Gundam got a movie trilogy to sort of compress it and streamline it, and so you may be tempted to watch that to save time. However, it's bait. So first of all, well, it's kind of strange. It's a little jarring because the movie trilogy for Zeta Gundam uses clips from the original Zeta Gundam, but certain scenes are reanimated, and so it will, without warning, switch between old animation and new animation, which is a little jarring. It's kind of interesting to watch, though, just if you want to see the animation itself. But not only is that really jarring, but the main reason why I advise against watching that is because they actually changed the ending. So, remember how I said Tomino was super depressed when he made this? Well, it has a really depressing ending, newsflash. And so, as a way to sort of atone for making this super depressing, he gave the movie trilogy a much happier ending. And while that is great and all, it's not canon, because the next core show in the Universal Century timeline is going to be Double Zeta. And if you watch the Zeta movie trilogy and then go into Double Zeta, you are going to immediately be met with something that's super confusing if you did not see the actual canon ending. So if you really want to see the reanimated scenes in the movie trilogy of Zeta Gundam, I recommend watching it after this, because like I said, the ending in this is very important, and you will be super confused going into Double Zeta if you have not seen the ending to this. But I'll say it again, this is the best one, so you definitely should not skip this one if you intend to watch and understand the Universal Century timeline. Double Zeta Gundam is the next required viewing in the UC timeline, and conversely, Double Zeta Gundam is actually the worst show in the UC timeline. So Zeta Gundam is the best, and then Double Zeta, which immediately follows it, is the worst. Unfortunately, like I said, this is a required viewing. A lot of important stuff happens in this, and so if you skip this, once again, you are going to be very confused, and so you just kind of have to watch it. What's really strange is that the first half is what's bad. Okay, so like I said, in Zeta Gundam, Tomino was super depressed when he made it. However, in between finishing Zeta Gundam and starting production of this, his mental health got a bit better, and he sort of wanted to make up for how depressing he made Zeta Gundam. And so this show immediately starts out with a much more comical tone. It's very bizarre, though, because the events that are taking place in this show are still just as serious as the events that took place in the other shows. However, it has this very strange comical tone, and characters just don't take things as seriously as they should, and the humor is just overall out of place, and it doesn't win me over. And that's why this one is not that great, so you kind of have to get through that. However, only the first half of this is like that, and then once you get into the second half, it resumes being more like Zeta Gundam. So the second half of this is actually very good. The second half of this feels like a true worthy successor of Zeta Gundam. But you're just going to have to watch all of it. It's kind of funny to see how weird the first half of this is. Probably a lot more entertaining to watch if you're watching it with someone else. You can kind of commentate with someone. But yeah, that's Double Zeta Gundam. I'm really glad it's on Blu-ray now, just because it took a while for it to get a Blu-ray. In fact, I don't think this has an English dub. Yeah, this never got an English dub. And so a very, very important piece of the Universal Century timeline you have to watch in Japanese. But the dubs, the Japanese isn't bad, so that's fine. I'm just pointing out this one isn't very popular and wasn't very popular for a while, so it was sort of hidden behind the wall of it not being localized. So that's my point. Here is the first movie I'm going to talk about in the Universal Century timeline, and that is Mobile Suit Gundam Char's Counterattack. Remember when I was talking about Gundam 0079, I was talking about how it introduces the characters Amuro Ray and Char Aznable? Well, in this movie, they've both gotten older and they both have a lot more experience, and this is where they finally do one last face-off against each other, and their rivalry really comes to a head here, and it's really a clash of philosophies. And it's just a really exciting conclusion between their relationship. And also, it leads to a very significant phenomenon that will get referred back to in things like Gundam Unicorn. So once again, very important piece of the Universal Century timeline puzzle. And also, it's just a movie, so it doesn't take very long to watch. The animation is good. And with it being a movie, you only have to buy one Blu-ray. I should have mentioned it before, but both Double Zeta Gundam and Zeta Gundam, you will have to buy in Part 1 and Part 2. So Zeta Gundam, you have to buy Part 1 and Part 2 of that, and then Double Zeta Gundam, you have to buy Part 1 and Part 2 of that to get all the episodes. Just like how when I showed Gundam 0079, I showed you the Part 1 and Part 2. But with this, just one case, you just have to buy one disc for this. Very good movie, and you should watch it. Next up is Gundam Unicorn, which is one of my favorite Gundam shows ever. So I actually don't own Gundam Unicorn, despite it being one of my favorites, and that's just because with it being one of the newer shows, it's actually really accessible. It's really easy to watch because they put it on Netflix. I think it's also on Crunchyroll as well. I think it's kind of a shame, though, that this one specifically is a lot more accessible to watch than some of the other Gundam shows, because Gundam Unicorn, although you could probably try to understand it at a bare minimum by watching it without having seen the other Universal Century stuff, you are not going to appreciate the sheer extent of this show unless you have seen all the other core Universal Century timeline shows that I have been going through in this video. Gundam Unicorn is a love letter to not only the whole Universal Century timeline, but it's a love letter to the people that have watched it. It's a love letter to the fans that have stuck with Gundam. And it does this in such a sophisticated way. It's not just cheap fan service, and it's not specifically references per se either. It's what I would call simulated nostalgia, and that sounds very strange, but you will know it when you see it. So when I say simulated nostalgia, it's kind of hard to explain without spoiling anything, but basically, you're going to have these recurring elements and scenes play out in Unicorn that are extremely reminiscent of things that happened in other UC timeline shows. And so you might expect it to go one way because you've sort of felt like you've seen it before, but then it ends up in a different way. And it makes it all the better because of it, because Gundam Unicorn, overall, it just has a very happy ending, and it puts a nice bow on the Universal Century timeline. It's not actually the last show chronologically in the Universal Century timeline, but in my mind, I kind of consider it as the last show chronologically, because it puts such a nice bow. When I say bow, I mean like you wrap it up like a present and put a figurative bow on it. It puts such a nice bow on everything that started since Gundam 0079, everything that started with the 1-year war, all the grudges that were started because of it, the relationship between Amuro Ray and Char Aznable and the other people they affected, and pretty much everything that was directly related, everything that was both directly and indirectly related to everything about the Universal Century timeline that started since the beginning gets addressed here and gets wrapped up. It feels like you have no loose ends, and like I said, it just is such a nice and happy send-off for the Universal Century timeline. In my mind, it is the ending, because everything that happens after this feels kind of disconnected, not because they don't take place in the Universal Century timeline, but because after Gundam Unicorn, it's so far in the future. Everything after Unicorn feels so far in the future that it feels disconnected from the people and the events that took place pre-Unicorn. In other words, in my mind, if Gundam Unicorn were the last Gundam to be made in the Universal Century timeline ever, I would be completely content with that because of how well it wraps up all these character arcs that were started in other shows. Also, the music in Unicorn was done by Hiroyuki Sawano, so there's that too. Also, I should point out, to avoid any kind of confusion, Gundam Unicorn was originally released as an OVA series. I think it's in 7 parts or something like that. So it's released originally as a 7-part OVA series. However, Gundam Unicorn Re-0096, because it takes place in the year 0096, but Gundam Unicorn Re-0096, I think it's called, is a reformatting of the show because it was released as an OVA originally, but then when they aired it on television in Japan, they had to chop it up and divide it into episode-long segments, and then it was aired that way. I recommend not watching it in that format. It really doesn't matter because it's still the same footage and it's still the same. It's just the format is what's different. But I would recommend watching it in the OVA series instead of the episodic format because it does not fit the episodic format at all. Because, for example, in the OVA series, like let's say one OVA episode is about an hour long, right? That hour-long episode can have some action scenes, it can have some talking scenes, and the talking scene in an OVA might be as long as a normal episode, but when you're watching the OVA, it doesn't seem boring, it doesn't seem overly drawn out, because an OVA episode is about an hour long, and so if 30 minutes of that OVA was comprised of characters talking to each other, that probably wouldn't bother you. However, when you chop it up into episode format, and when you chop it up into 23-minute segments, that means you're going to end up with an entire episode that is just these two characters talking to each other in this same room, and then when you go on to the next episode, it will still be these characters talking to each other in the same room. And not only that, because the formatting is so weird, you get these really unnecessarily long recaps whenever you go to a new episode. So yeah, there's that. So if you watched Gundam Unicorn as the episodic format and you thought it was super boring, that's probably why. So I recommend watching it as the OVA series. Like I said, pretty sure it's on Netflix, and Netflix has it in OVA format, so that's ideal. Another thing I should say about Gundam Unicorn is that it's also very soap opera-y because it tries to make such a happy ending for Gundam, and it tries to really encapsulate what Gundam is all about. It really tries to push this anti-war narrative, and so in doing that, it comes off as very preachy at times, kind of soap opera-like. And so you might get turned off from that. I know some people do, but just know that when going into it. It's very good, though. Next up is another movie. So now this is the second movie so far that I'm talking about in the Universal Century timeline, and that is Mobile Suit Gundam Narrative. This is actually the newest piece of Gundam media to release, and I do like it. However, like I already talked about, everything that takes place after Gundam Unicorn, I don't really take with as much reverence, but it is a good movie, and the main thing that this is about is that, also Hiroyuki Sawano does the music for this as well. So he sort of reprises his musical role from Gundam Unicorn. So, it feels related to Gundam Unicorn in that sense. However, the art style in this is much more of like a contemporary anime art style, whereas the art style in Gundam Unicorn, with it being modern, the character designs still sort of looked like they were influenced by the 70s character designs from the 70s, I mean. But in this, they just go full-on contemporary anime style, which is a little jarring. It was a little jarring to me, but I still got over it because it doesn't look bad. But the main thing this movie is about is that it really opens up and expands new type abilities and sort of it has a lot of setup. It sets up a lot of this stuff new types can do. It kind of, I don't want to spoil anything, but it sort of kind of opens up time travel. So far, there has been nothing mentioned about time travel throughout the whole Universal Century timeline, but they kind of start talking about this. They kind of start teasing time travel in this. So potentially Gundam shows we get after this that take place in the UC timeline might start involving time travel, and that can start getting things messy. But this is very interesting just because of how powerful they start to discover new types are. Some people really don't like new type stuff because they don't like all the new type magic type stuff. I mean, it's not technically magic, but you can kind of conceptualize it as weird magic stuff, you know, like a Jedi or something like that. Jedi from Star Wars. But I don't understand how you could have gotten this far into the Gundam Universal Century timeline without at least tolerating new types. So if you've watched all these Gundam shows in order, as I've been recommending you do, then I don't understand how you could get to this point without having already accepted new types. So if you ever hear anyone complaining about this one and the new type shenanigans, it's probably because they don't like new types, but it is a good movie. Gundam Hathaway, as of recording this video, is not actually out yet, but I very much hope to see it in theaters when it does release in the West. But Gundam Hathaway is supposed to immediately follow up Gundam Narrative, and it's supposed to sort of segue the events in between Gundam Narrative and Gundam F91, which I hope it does pretty well because, as I've been saying, the jump from Gundam Narrative to Gundam F91 feels so vast. I would really like to see how that transition happened. And Gundam Hathaway is looking like it'll be very good, so I'm really excited to see what that is. But it's not out yet, so I can't necessarily recommend it or not, but just letting you know what that is, because potentially some people watching this video might be watching it after Gundam Hathaway came out, and so that's where it would be in the timeline. Presumably another pretty important thing to watch, but maybe not, depending on how it segues Gundam Narrative to F91, because the antagonist faction in Gundam F91, their origins are never really explained that well. They're just kind of there at the start of F91, and so it'll be really interesting to see if they show the origins of that enemy faction and also sort of develop their philosophy a bit better, and then that in turn would make Gundam F91 better by proxy, because if the antagonist faction in Gundam F91 has some better justification, even if that justification is from another show, movie in this case, that would be good just overall. So anyways, that's what Gundam Hathaway is, or Hathaway's Flash. It's based off of a novel called Hathaway's Flash, I think, but the movie is just going to be simply called Gundam Hathaway. So now we are really far into the Universal Century timeline with Gundam F91, which starts in the year 0123. So we're pretty far in the future at this point. And I was already talking about how disconnected this stuff feels from the rest of the UC timeline, despite it technically taking place in the same continuity. And one of the big reasons for that is because up to this point, so from the very start of the Universal Century timeline, so starting with Gundam The Origin and Gundam 0079, all the way to Gundam Narrative, the protagonist faction and the antagonist faction have been more or less the same. So Gundam 0079 started with the Zeon, the Republic of Zeon, as the antagonist faction, right? So even though you technically have things like Neo Zeon and Zeon Remnants, every kind of antagonist faction that pops up after Gundam 0079 is either part of Zeon or directly influenced by Zeon. And so even if Zeon as we knew them are gone at some points in the timeline, you still feel their presence. And you still feel Zeon's philosophy because they had such a strong philosophy that influenced so many people. And so now, without Zeon, it's a really difficult role to fill. It would be really hard for any kind of antagonist faction to be as intimidating as Zeon. And so that's why Gundam F91 kind of falls short. However, most of its problems can actually be accredited to the fact that its script, oh, by the way, this is another movie, but most of the problems with this can be accredited to the fact that its script was originally written for a big show with lots of episodes. However, what we got was a movie, and so they had to crush this really long script down into a movie-sized format, and so it feels extremely rushed. Scene transitions are super jarring because it goes from one spot to another spot, and it feels like you missed like an entire scene in between, because probably you did. The animation is nice though, so it's definitely worth watching, but it's not really a must watch. I watched that one recently just because I've been putting it off so long, and yeah, it's definitely kind of strange. After Gundam F91 is Victory Gundam. Once again, the enemy faction in this is not Zeon related, so the antagonist faction isn't really that great. It's not very intimidating. They don't have that strong of a philosophy. Also, This show is just not good. It's really funny, though, to watch, just because with this being made by Tomino, it's really funny to see where his headspace was during this, because during this show's production, they kept pushing Tomino to introduce more mobile suits so they could market more Gundam models and toys and things like that. And he very much does not like that sort of thing. Because, for example, Gundam 0079. In Gundam 0079, Tomino originally wanted the main mobile suit to be all white. Obviously, what we got was something that was white, red, yellow, and blue, because they eventually, the investors pushed him into making a suit that was much more marketable as a plastic model or an action figure because of all of its bright primary colors, right? So he caved in and let them do that. However, he agreed that he would design the Zeon mobile suits, the Zaku. So the Zakus, which look way more militaristic and no nonsense, Tomino designed, and the Gundam as we know it, the main Gundam, the RX-78-2, was influenced a lot by investors wanting to push for merchandising. So something that's really cool about Gundam Unicorn, like I said, Gundam Unicorn, I know I'm supposed to be talking about Victory Gundam right now, but this has a point. Gundam Unicorn was based off of a novel, first of all. I should have mentioned that earlier. But anyways, the main mobile suit in Gundam Unicorn is all white. Well, it has two different modes. When it's in like its unicorn mode with its V-fin stuck together as a horn, hence the name Unicorn, it's all white. But when it opens up, you see red psycho frame. But anyways, the suit in one of its forms is all white. So basically, remember how I said Unicorn is a love letter to the Universal Century timeline? Unicorn finally gave Tomino his white mobile suit. And so that's sort of a meta thing. But anyways, my whole point of this story is that Tomino is very much not into the whole merchandise side of things, even though it's kind of a necessary evil if you want a show or something like that to stay afloat, because you need to make money in order to keep making the show, right? So during Victory Gundam's production, the investors kept pushing him to constantly introduce more mobile suits so they could sell more merchandise. Tomino didn't like that, and so as a way to sort of lash back at these investors, he went ahead and did as they asked by introducing a ton more suits. However, to get back at them, he would kill off so many characters as sort of payback. So there are so many deaths in Victory Gundam. There are so many shocking, unceremonious deaths in Victory Gundam that just happen. So it's really funny to watch this and realize that Tomino is just killing off his characters out of angst from investors pushing him into introducing all these suits. So that's the main reason I would watch it. I haven't watched all of it yet just because it's really not that good, but I eventually one day want to watch all of Victory Gundam and see just how many deaths are in that. So now, before talking about some of the other continuities, some of the smaller continuities, I'm going to mention Turn A Gundam. And you might think that's weird because you might have seen that the timeline in which Turn A Gundam takes place is referred to as the correct century timeline, or the CC timeline. So yes, the timeline in which Turn A Gundam takes place is called correct century, but let me just try to explain this. So I kind of want to explain this now before I start talking about the other continuities, but this might sound kind of strange because I have never encountered another piece of media that handles timelines in this way. So when they call it the correct century, what they mean is that Turn A Gundam takes place so far in the future that it canonizes all of the other continuities. In other words, it's saying that given an infinite amount of time, every single one of these different continuities in the Gundam franchise will eventually have all taken place and will all collectively lead to Turn A Gundam. So I hope I'm explaining that well. It's a little abstract and kind of strange because, like I said, I've never encountered that before. But anyways, the reason this is relevant is that in Turn A Gundam, people will dig up mobile suits out of the ground and find suits from different shows that did not take place in the same continuity. So with this very weird abstract premise, they are able to pretty much just make suits show up from different franchises, even though they never technically belonged in the same continuity, but they do now. So that's pretty interesting. However, this is not a required viewing. So remember when I was talking about the required viewings in the Universal Century timeline? Turn A Gundam is actually a standalone thing. You can watch it by itself. It's kind of interesting to know that whole timeline thing I was explaining, but you don't really even need to know that. You can literally just watch Turn A Gundam by itself without having watched any of the other Gundams. It's very unique in that it feels a bit more like a Studio Ghibli film, or it's a series. So it just has much more of a Ghibli vibe than all the other Gundam shows. It has a strange slice of lifeiness to it. Let me just explain the general premise of the show, though. So basically, some kind of big war happened off-screen before the show starts, which stranded some humans on the moon on a moon base. Presumably a moon base that's kind of like in Gundam 0079 and the rest of the UC timeline, they have bases on the moon. So presumably during some kind of war, humanity and civilization as we knew it on the Earth got reset. So presumably there was some sort of hard reset of civilization on the Earth. And then people basically had to rebuild civilization from sticks and stones. They had to restart as cavemen and then sort of rediscover all this technology. And they sort of lost their history on Earth. So from their perspective, the humans on Earth don't actually know that they're in a sort of rebooted civilization. However, some humans were living on these moon bases when this civilization reboot happened on Earth. And the people in these moon bases never lost any of their technology or their history. So these people in the moon bases were actually waiting for Earth to become habitable again. And so they start sending down colonists, and our main character in Turn A Gundam, focus. Our main character in Turn A Gundam is one of these colonists who was a moon person. He was part of the moon civilization, and he was sent to live on Earth. The conflict starts, however, when the people from the moon come back down and they effectively want to colonize all of Earth. It's very much sort of a parallel to the British Empire making their colonies back when they did that. And the humans on the Earth at this point, when the moon people are coming down, have reached an industrial revolution. So they've basically rediscovered steam power, and they're in an industrial revolution. So it's a very interesting setting because you have these humans in an industrial revolution with steam power, and they're just discovering like how to make an airplane, and they're having to fight these humans that flew down from the moon in these mobile suits. And so you'd think, okay, that sounds really one-sided. How would the people on Earth stand a chance? Well, our main character helped them dig up some of these mobile suits that I was mentioning before. So our main character helps them dig up these suits underground, and he sort of shows them how to use it. But our main character acts as a mediator between the moon people and the Earth humans. So there's a lot of debating that happens. There's a lot of discussing. Being from the moon, he very much sympathizes with them, but he wants everyone to reach a middle ground in which everyone will be happy with each other. Like I said, it's kind of slice of lifey, but a very interesting show. If like a lot of like heavy action stuff kind of gets boring to you after a while, and you just kind of want to watch something refreshing, then Turn A Gundam is definitely different in that regard. Different in that it is not like the rest of the Gundam shows, because there's not that much action. It does have action, but it's its own thing. Also, the animation is super good because, by the way, Tomino made this. In my opinion, this is Tomino's last good work, because I will talk about the other thing he made later. But Turn A Gundam, the animation is so good because this is actually the last traditionally animated Gundam show before they switched to computer animation. So this is that sweet, sweet late 90s animation when it is at its peak. And the mech designer, I forget the guy's name, but the guy that designed the main mech in Turn A Gundam was the guy that designed a lot of the stuff in Blade Runner, I'm pretty sure. So they got a guy with some pretty high respect in terms of his sci-fi designs. And that is why the Gundam in Turn A Gundam, the Turn A Gundam, looks so unique, because instead of having a V-fin on his forehead, which is sort of a staple in Gundams, it has a V-fin on the bottom of its face, and it's curved, so it kind of looks like a mustache. It's just a very, very unique and novel design. It kind of weirds a lot of people out, but for most people it grows on them, and I definitely really dig the design. So anyways, Turn A Gundam is really good, and you can watch it by itself. I know that was a long-winded one to talk about, but that's because it has a lot of context, but you don't even have to know the context to get into it. Just try watching the show, and if you like it, you like it. Now that I've given an explanation of what the Universal Century is and also what Turn A Gundam is, I think it would be fitting if the next continuity we talk about is the Future Century, and the Future Century is what Mobile Fighter G Gundam takes place in. Mobile Fighter G Gundam was very contentious when it first came out, because Mobile Fighter G Gundam is the first non-Universal Century timeline Gundam show, and that's why it's so contentious, and that's why I think it's fitting that should be the first one we talk about after the UC timeline. So here's a little history. Mobile Suit Gundam, the original, Gundam 0079, when it first came out, it did not do too well in the United States. However, Mobile Fighter G Gundam did really well in the States, because what's funny about Mobile Fighter G Gundam, and what makes it so awesome, is that despite Gundam being started with being a real robot genre, like despite Gundam starting out as a deconstruction of the super robot genre, Mobile Fighter G Gundam actually is a super robot show. It's a lot more like Dragon Ball Z than it is an actual military show. So that's going to turn off a lot of people. Well, actually, it's looked upon more fondly now, because the main concern at the time was that people in Japan who liked the original Gundam were worried that that was going to be the new face of Gundam moving forward. They didn't want Gundam to lose its identity as a deconstruction of the super robot genre. Fortunately though, Mobile Fighter G Gundam was just a one-time thing, just a one-off, and with that, I think everyone can appreciate it more. And because of that, it's actually one of my favorite Gundams. I would actually go out of the way and say it's my favorite Gundam show, but in saying that, it's kind of strange, because it's nothing like the other Gundams, because Mobile Fighter G Gundam is my favorite Gundam show, but the reasons I like Mobile Fighter G Gundam are not the reasons I like the Gundam franchise at large. So I kind of consider it as a separate thing. I think of it more as just an entirely different show, but it's super cool because the whole thing revolves around a martial arts tournament, and the main character, Domon Kashu, is a martial artist naturally, and instead of piloting these mechs with the typical interface that we're used to, the mech has a full body tracking system. And something I really like about Mobile Fighter G Gundam is that although it's super stupid in a good way, it doesn't insult the audience's intelligence, because they constantly introduce to you and show you these weird technologies and stuff like this full body tracking system, but they never hammer you over the head with it, because they know you're smart enough to immediately understand how it works, because it's not that hard to figure out. So they basically put on this unitard. They basically put on a mocap suit, actually, now that I think about it. They put on a mocap suit, and this chamber tracks their movements, and the mobile suit will copy their movements one-to-one, ideally. And so that's how martial arts is able to translate to piloting a mech in making it do all these martial arts moves. So it's super cool, super hype. The ending is one of the hypest things ever. If you like shows like Gurren Lagann, then I think you will definitely like Mobile Fighter G Gundam, because the ending just gets so crazy and so ludicrous and so dumb, but it's so well deserved at the end. It's such a nice ending, and it's just so very bombastic, and there's a lot of yelling, and if you like that sort of thing, you will probably like Mobile Fighter G Gundam. After Mobile Fighter G Gundam is Gundam Wing. A lot of you might be familiar with this, because Gundam Wing was actually the introduction for a lot of Gundam fans in the West. A lot of Gundam fans in the West were introduced to Gundam by watching Gundam Wing on Toonami. And I started watching Gundam Wing reruns and stuff on Toonami as well. Gundam Wing is definitely not bad. There's going to be a lot of nostalgia surrounding it, because like I said, so many people started Gundam by watching that, so a lot of them are going to be positively biased towards it. But like Mobile Fighter G Gundam, it takes place in its own continuity. However, Mobile Suit Gundam Wing was supposed to be and is kind of a return to form in that it goes back to being much more about this war with the military rather than it being a martial arts tournament. So it's much more consistent with the kinds of stories that we're used to in the Universal Century Timeline Gundam shows. However, it doesn't really execute it with quite the same amount of finesse, and it's also in its own continuity, so it doesn't have as much lore to build upon. And there's a lot of just really funny, corny dialogue. Some of it's just mega cheese. It's really campy. I enjoy it for that. There's some really funny lines and funny scenes in it. I definitely watch it with nostalgia. I like it a lot. It's definitely a decent entry point, so I don't think it's a bad thing that a lot of people were introduced to Gundam through it. But just keep in mind, there's a lot of bias surrounding this. It's mostly well-deserved, but it's also pretty campy at the same time. Also, near the end, I think it kind of falls off near the end because some of the characters' decisions feel like they get compromised for the sake of the plot. It feels like they start sacrificing. When I say sacrificing characters, I don't mean necessarily that they kill the characters, but I mean it seems like they're sacrificing what the characters are about for the sake of the plot near the end. But there are some really cool mobile suits in this show. The Wing Gundam is one of my favorites ever. I know a lot of people's favorite Gundams are the Heavy Arms and Gundam Death Scythe. But yeah, there's some really cool suits in this, and you can't really go wrong with Gundam Wing. Directly after Gundam Wing is a movie called Gundam Wing Endless Waltz, and this is something you can't watch on its own. You have to have already seen Gundam Wing because it directly leads into it. Gundam Wing Endless Waltz, I would rate about the same as Gundam Wing as itself, because Gundam Wing Endless Waltz, the story is kind of forgettable, but there are some really cool scenes. The animation's really cool. The animation's very good. Something that's also kind of cool that we got out of this is that the designs of the mobile suits in Gundam Wing Endless Waltz are different. So if you've seen the Wing Gundam with actual bird-looking wings with actual feather designs, that's the wing design from Endless Waltz. So canonically, it didn't actually change its look. Canonically, they basically say it's looked the same the whole time, but just visually we get a different look, and it doesn't, the look of the suits doesn't affect the story or anything, so it doesn't bother me, but it's really cool that we got more suit designs out of it. Like the Heavy Arms looks different, the Gundam Death Scythe looks different, and so on. So that's what Gundam Wing Endless Waltz is. If you've watched Gundam Wing, you might as well watch Endless Waltz if you can. I know sometimes the movie's kind of expensive to buy. Sometimes Gundam Info puts it up. Actually, I was going to mention this later, but since I brought it up already, I might as well just talk about it. Gundam Info is the official YouTube channel for Gundam on YouTube. And at any given time, they usually have like 2 or 3 Gundam shows that you can watch for free, whether it's a show or a movie, and they rotate, they cycle out every few months. So whenever they put something for free on Gundam Info, if you haven't seen it yet, you make sure you watch it before it gets exchanged for something else. And I think that's really nice because, well, first of all, there aren't many avenues to watch Gundam legally in the West anyway, and so I really like supporting it in any way I can, so make sure you're subscribed to Gundam Info as well as this channel, Tanuki Type. I should also mention that at this point, because we're just going through the different continuities that aren't Universal Century, I'm not really going through these in any kind of particular order. But the next one I want to talk about is After War Gundam X. This is actually one of my favorites. If I'm excluding Mobile Fighter G Gundam, I would say this is probably my favorite. My top 3 favorite Gundam shows are Mobile Fighter G Gundam, Gundam Unicorn, and After War Gundam X. After War Gundam X is super, super underrated. I never hear people talk about it, even though it's one of the best. What makes After War Gundam X so interesting is that it takes place in a post-apocalypse. So remember the 1-year war in the year 0079 in the Universal Century? This is sort of an alternate timeline to the Universal Century timeline. An alternate timeline in which the 1-year war didn't just take out half of the human population, it took out like 99% of the human population. So this is an alternate history, an alternate history to the Universal Century timeline, where the 1 Year War was even more disastrous than it was in the UC timeline. And so it pretty much it pretty much crippled society, and it turned Earth into like this Mad Max type environment, where people are having to, struggle to survive and things like that, and raiders make camps and things like that. But what's interesting is that because this is sort of an alternate timeline to the UC timeline, people did live in space colonies. People did live in space colonies prior to this war destroying society as they knew it. And so that actually does come into play. That actually is relevant to the story. However, the real reason why After War Gundam X is so good is because of the characters. So I haven't mentioned this yet because I've just been gushing about the franchise, but something Gundam does not traditionally do very well is the romance. Typically, most Gundam shows have a very tacked on romance, a very forced romance between the main character and someone else, and it just feels like the writer is forcing them together. Now kiss just because they're supposed to, and so I've sort of just grown accustomed to that, just because I expect that from Gundam, and I kind of take it as one of its charms. Like, oh no, here comes the forced romance. It's just part of the deal. But with After War Gundam X, the romantic subplot that takes place in this actually feels believable. It is the actual most believable romantic subplot of any of the Gundam shows. Not only that, but all the characters in general are the best. After War Gundam X has the most believable characters, the most well-written characters, the most sympathetic characters, and it also just has a really good ending. So if you're tired of a lot of the depressing endings from other Gundam shows, After War Gundam X has a very nice ending. And like I said, it just has the best characters, and it's criminally underrated. So I really hope you give After War Gundam X a chance. It sort of starts out with the main character getting a hold of the X Gundam. So the X Gundam is one of the Gundams. Okay, so basically, remember how I said this was like Mad Max? Basically, if you get a hold of a Gundam, you've basically gotten a hold of some war relic that will really help you out, right? Because think Fallout. Remember how, if you've played the video game series Fallout, new things aren't really being made much, but you find technology that was used during the war and you sort of refurbish it. So people in this setting in After War Gundam X will get these mobile suits from the war that destroyed society, and they will refurbish them and sort of use, like raiders will get a hold of mobile suits and use it to intimidate other camps, so they can steal from them and stuff. And so that's sort of the starting premise. So the main characters aren't necessarily part of any kind of Earth Federation or anything like that, although there are remnants of an Earth Federation, and sort of the father figure of the group actually was an Earth Federation soldier. And they actually get into PTSD and that sort of thing, which is something that was never addressed in any of the other Gundam shows. Like I said, the characters in this are just super good. Also, new types are in this, which is interesting because this is not a Universal Century timeline show, but like I said, it's an alternate version of it. So new types are in this in kind of the same way they are in the Universal Century timeline. However, the new type, the whole concept of a new type in After War Gundam X is strangely executed with more finesse than how new types are portrayed in the original Gundam, which is strange, right? So yeah, After War Gundam X, super good. I could probably keep talking about it, but I think you should just go watch it yourself. I just remembered that After War Gundam X is actually shorter than a typical Gundam show. Typically, Gundam shows have like 50-something episodes, whereas After War Gundam X has like 38, I think. I haven't checked. This is just me remembering. It's like 38 or something. Because remember how I said this is criminally underrated? The show got really mediocre ratings when it first aired. And so even though it was originally planned for 50-something episodes, they had to cut it short, which is a huge shame. That's so sad. But anyways, even with them having to cut it short, they definitely utilized what screen time they did have. At this point, I feel as if I should talk about Gundam 00. Gundam 00 is a pretty decent entry point, if you ask me. I do like Gundam 00 a lot. I think it could have been better, though. What makes Gundam 00 kind of unique, though, is that it feels much more, how do I describe this? So, the main cast The main cast in Gundam 00 belongs to an organization called Celestial Being, and Celestial Being's goal is to eradicate warfare of all kinds, and they effectively do this by threatening everybody. They effectively announce to the world that anybody that tries to start a war will be dealt with by military force. And so other people try to point out the hypocrisy in that. But anyways, my whole point is that the main characters in this are much more ambitious and almost overly idealistic compared to the other Gundam shows, because the other Gundam shows portray war in a very realistic way and have a lot of politics involved and things like that. However, in Gundam 00, the main cast belongs to this organization, which is effectively not an antagonist, but they are the ones sort of starting this whole ordeal, whereas normally an antagonist is the one that starts an inciting incident or starts an issue, and then the protagonists have to react to that. But in Gundam 00, the main cast is so proactive in spearheading this goal by Celestial Being that they are viewed as antagonists by a lot of other countries. Some countries view them as terrorists. But trying to end warfare of all kinds, like banning war across the whole globe, that's some big talk. So like I said, this one is very... the cast is just very overly idealistic, and so this show deals with much more grand topics. It feels a little Power Ranger-y, not in terms of campiness, but because, like I said, the main cast is sort of like a team, and they all wear different colors, and they live in this space station, or they live in this ship which orbits the Earth, so they live in this ship around Earth, so it's kind of like they're talking to Zordon. You know how the Power Rangers will confer with Zordon before doing their missions and stuff like that. So it feels a lot different than other Gundam shows. Once again, this is in its own unique continuity, so you can watch it by itself without having any knowledge prior. I like the main character. He sort of becomes a caricature by the end, though. This show also addresses religion and things like that, which was something that was untouched by other Gundam shows more or less up to this point, so that's pretty interesting. I think they could have gone a bit further with some of the relationships that they introduce. But anyways, Gundam 00 is very good. If I were to criticize it more, I'd have to be nitpicking a bit. But it is very good, and it also has a movie, which is Gundam 00 Awakening of the Trailblazer. So here's where I will kind of talk about some more oddities of Gundam 00. If you watch Gundam 00 by itself, you will not get a very concise ending. You're going to kind of be left hanging if you watch Gundam 00 by itself. So you might as well watch the movie, because the movie gives the series a proper ending. The Awakening of the Trailblazer is basically the ending to the series Gundam 00. However, Awakening of the Trailblazer, the movie, is not in and of itself a good movie. It's not a good movie. Its plot structure isn't like a normal movie, because it's written more like it's a big ending scene. However, in addition to that, not only is it just not a great movie, but it also introduces extraterrestrials, and this is the only piece of Gundam media to have extraterrestrials in it. So it does not feel like Gundam at all. So it's not a great movie just because the format is really weird, like the story structure doesn't follow a normal story arc. And it has aliens, so it doesn't feel like Gundam. So when you're watching this, you're asking yourself, why am I watching this? But it's to get a concise ending for Gundam 00, because Awakening of the Trailblazer actually does have a very good ending. Like I said, it fits the themes. I don't want to spoil it, obviously. But the ending that you get in Awakening of the Trailblazer is very consistent with the kind of grand themes, the very extremely idealistic themes that had been sort of proposed and teased during Gundam 00. So if you finish 00 and you don't feel content with the ending you got, you should watch Awakening of the Trailblazer. But if you feel content with the ending, then you don't really need to watch Awakening of the Trailblazer. But I just had to mention that it had aliens in it, because no other Gundam thing has aliens. As for Mobile Suit Gundam Seed, I have a lot to say about it. even though I haven't actually finished Seed. So I'm just going to kind of lump all of the Gundam Seed shows together, because there's Gundam Seed, and then there's Gundam Seed Destiny, and then there's some other peripheral media to surround that as well. But Gundam Seed and Gundam Seed Destiny are the main Gundam Seed shows. And remember how I was saying that Turn A Gundam was the last traditionally animated Gundam show, which makes it look amazing because it was when the animators were at their peak. They had a lot of expertise with how to animate things traditionally, and it just looks really good. Well, Gundam Seed, conversely, is the first Gundam show to be animated by computer animation, and it definitely shows. Anybody that's familiar with the history of animation will already know that when people initially switched over to computer animation, everything looked really, really rough. Not because computer animation is objectively worse than traditional animation. You can make the case that traditional animation is objectively better, but the reason why it was so bad looking wasn't because it's on computer animation, because obviously by now we've gotten some really good looking computer animation. The main reason is because the people doing the computer animation, these animators, suddenly had to switch mediums. These animators who have been animating traditionally had to suddenly switch over to computer animation, and they were still learning the medium and learning how to make things look good on computers. So a lot of anime around this era just looks really rough. And Gundam Seed is no exception. Not only is the animation really rough, the character designs are very off-putting. I really don't like the art style in this show. Another kind of common symptom of anime around this era, and just shows in general around this show, but particularly anime, is something called same face syndrome, I've heard it called. And that's when all the characters have pretty much the same face, and the only thing that differentiates them is their hairstyle and hair color. And all the characters in Gundam Seed look like that. All the characters in Gundam Seed look the same except their hair, and that's really off-putting and strange, and I could never get over it. Call me shallow, but I just can't get over it when the animation looks like that. So I could never get over how the show looked. But despite that, even if you can get over how the show looks, the reason why I didn't finish it is because I was bored, and the reason I was bored is because Mobile Seed is effectively a retelling of the original Mobile Suit Gundam. It basically takes the script of Mobile Suit Gundam and pretty much copies it one-to-one. Like, there's a difference between paying homage to something versus pretty much just copying it, but it follows so closely to the script of Mobile Suit Gundam, the original, that I was never surprised by anything happening. It probably gets different in Seed Destiny, but I kept watching episodes, I kept watching more and more episodes, and it never did anything to differentiate itself from just being a watered down version of Gundam 0079, so I stopped watching it. However, I'm sure it gets different, but I just don't want to sit through a bunch of stuff I feel like I've seen already, especially when the animation isn't great. However, because my negative opinion of it is partially coming from me having already seen the original Gundam, I bet if I had seen Gundam Seed before the original Gundam, I would have definitely liked Gundam Seed more. So if you haven't seen Gundam 0079, you will probably like Seed more if you watch Gundam Seed first. But once you've seen Gundam 0079, Seed just feels so redundant when you're watching it. However, once again, I can't necessarily recommend that you watch Seed before Gundam 0079, because if you watch Gundam 0079, you can continue watching Universal Century stuff, whereas if you watch Seed, the only stuff that's going to immediately follow Seed is more Seed stuff. So, Gundam Seed, not my favorite. I haven't even finished it, so I don't know. If you've seen it, let me know if I should give it another chance, but that's Gundam Seed. Speaking of Gundam franchises I have not finished, time to talk about Tomino's most recent work, Reconguista in G, if I'm even pronouncing that correctly. And I can't even tell you what happens in this, even though I have seen several episodes of it, because it is impossible to tell what is going on, and it is super confusing, and I would never recommend it to anyone, but if you watch it, please tell me what the heck happens in this. He's kind of off his rocker in this. Tomino, I think Tomino was trying so hard to send some kind of message, probably an anti-war message, even though it could be anything and I wouldn't know. Domino was probably trying so hard to send some kind of message in this that it sort of overshadowed the importance of actually writing something comprehensible. So, yeah, like I said, Turn A Gundam is Tomino's last good work because after Turn A Gundam came this, and I don't know how you could go from Turn A Gundam to this, but just watch Turn A Gundam instead of this. A series I have seen even less of than Reconguista and G, because I really did try to give Reconguista and G a chance. I really did, I swear. I tried to understand it. I kept on watching it, but I just couldn't take it anymore. But a show that I've only seen like one episode of, and then I immediately realized that, it's not for me. I'm not really feeling much from this, is Gundam Age. The reason I don't really care for Gundam Age is because it feels like it's trying to target a younger audience a bit too hard, and obviously I'm not necessarily a fan of that. It kind of makes sense though in when you learn the context, and the context is that this was actually originally going to be a video game, not an animated show. The video game was going to be created by Level 5, the developer that makes a bunch of JRPGs. They did Ni no Kuni. That's one of the games they made. So Level 5, when they proposed the script to Bandai Namco liked it so much that they actually decided to just make it a show. If you ask me, I think they should have just made the game, because firstly, it's not that remarkable of a Gundam show. Even people I haven't met anybody whose favorite Gundam is Gundam Age. Even though it does have its fans, I don't think anybody's crazy about it. But, well, for one, like I said, it's a pretty unremarkable Gundam show. And two, there really aren't that many notable Gundam games. So I think having presumably it would have been an RPG. I'm just guessing because they make JRPGs. So having a bona fide Gundam JRPG, I think that sounds really interesting. It would have been really cool to go back and play and evaluate that way, but instead we got this show, and it didn't really hook me. The main gimmick of this show is that there are multiple time skips throughout this series, and so the story spans generations. So like obviously the first part of the show will have a cast of characters, and then there will be a time skip, and then the second big part of the show is going to involve the children of the main cast from the last part, and then there's a third part which are like the children of them. And so the people from the first part are the people in the third part's grandparents. I explained that in a much more complicated way than I needed to. But anyways, you get what I mean. That's sort of the whole gimmick. So like if you're really into cross-generational stories and stuff, it might be right up your alley. But I heard the pacing's really weird because of it. But I just don't really care to watch the rest myself to find out. But I'm not one of those people that feels like I need to watch every single Gundam thing to be a true Gundam fan. Another Gundam show that I've only seen like one episode of is Gundam Build Fighters. I'm just going to talk about the whole Build Fighters collectively because there's Gundam Build Fighters and Gundam Build Fighters Try, and I think it has some more peripheral media. But Gundam Build Fighters doesn't share anything with the rest of the Gundam franchise that makes me like the Gundam franchise. It's more like it's like a Pokemon or a Bakugan or a Beyblade type thing, because the whole premise of Gundam Build Fighters is that in this universe, Gundam is a media franchise like it is in our universe. But in Gundam Build Fighters, you can take your plastic models that you can build and you can put them like in this arena, and then they get teleported to this virtual battle arena where they battle each other like Pokemon or Bakugan or Beyblade. And that's just not why I like Gundam. When I watch Gundam, I want it to revolve around, war politics, things like that. So if you're into that kind of thing, maybe watch Gundam Build Fighters, but it's really nothing like Gundam. The only similarity it has is the name Gundam. Something that is cool about it, though, I've seen a couple clips just from people pointing it out. It's kind of cool how in Gundam Build Fighters, I mean, it's a cool idea, but it's not going to make me watch it. But Gundam Build Fighters, the universe in Gundam Build Fighters is sort of treated as this Valhalla for characters from other Gundam shows. So for example, big, popular, important characters from different Gundam shows that might have died in those shows will kind of show up as cameos in Gundam Build Fighters. Like they'll be walking by, and then you'll just see one of the characters from a different franchise. So one theory is that, oh, this universe is like a Valhalla of characters that died from the rest of the Gundam show, or have ascended from the rest of the Gundam show, from the rest of the Gundam franchise, I mean, sorry. So that's kind of interesting, but it's not going to make me watch kids smash their plastic models into each other. I saved Iron-Blooded Orphans for last because I did not want to end on Build Fighters of all things. So Iron-Blooded Orphans is one of the newer ones. It actually got a lot of newcomers. So, you know, originally Gundam Wing was the main thing that got a lot of people into Gundam in the West in the first place. Just going off of anecdotal evidence, I noticed that a lot of people sort of got into the Gundam franchise again by means of Iron-Blooded Orphans, so that's nice. And if lots of people are getting into the franchise that way, then it's probably a good way to get into the franchise, right? So Iron-Blooded Orphans is very good. I think it's one of the best. I really don't have many complaints about this at all. The thing about Iron-Blooded Orphans is that it is very gritty. It has sort of a strange art style, because at first the art style looks strangely contemporary, but not like just regular contemporary anime like how Gundam Narrative was. It has like a sort of it's sort of like drawn from the perspective of a kid, but it kind of makes sense because the main cast of characters start out as child soldiers. And so this whole show revolves around child soldiers, and it's very gritty and it's very dark. And I kind of think of it as the antithesis to Gundam 00, because remember when I was describing Gundam 00, I was saying how the main cast of characters in Gundam 00 are extremely idealistic and they want to pretty much invent world peace. Well, the characters in Iron-Blooded Orphans are ambitious, but they are not idealistic at all. They do not care about world peace. All they really care about is just securing their own safety and just making a comfortable living for themselves. And so it's much more grounded. It feels a lot like the 8th MS team, even though the main characters in Iron-Blooded Orphans are kids. It's very, very gritty and very militaristic like the 8th MS team. There are a lot of politics. There's a space mafia in Iron-Blooded Orphans, so then you get mafia politics involved. It's very cool. It has some really, really cool fights. It has some really, really cool mecha designs. The Barbatos Lupus is one of my favorite mobile suits. It's one of my favorite mobile suit designs ever, and that's from Iron-Blooded Orphans. So you can look forward to that if you watch it. And just be warned that there are some very crushing moments. There are some very brutal and abrupt deaths in this. And the ending isn't very happy either, but it portrays politics and war in a very realistic manner. Also in this, instead of it taking place between an Earth Federation and space colonies, Mars colonists pretty much take up the role that space colonists would have in other Gundam shows. So you have these people living on Mars, and the main characters start out as child soldiers on Mars, and they basically revolt against the company that sort of owns them, and they try to create their own company. And so the story follows their struggles at, like I said, trying to create just a comfortable living for everyone. So it's really good, really cool, but don't watch it if you can't handle like really, you know, crushing sad moments in a show, because the ending is not happy, but it's very good. Anyways, those are all the main Gundam shows and movies I wanted to cover. Obviously, there's more Gundam media that I didn't mention in this video just because the franchise is so big, but those are the main ones, and I hope that that helped you in getting into Gundam. Hopefully, at least one of those things I mentioned strikes your fancy and sounds interesting enough for you to get into it. So, if this video helped you get into Gundam, be sure to let me know in the comments, or if you have anything else to say, let me know in the comments. Like the video, and I will see you all later. Bye for now. One last thing, a lot of those Blu-rays I got, if you want to get Gundam Blu-rays as well for yourself, a good place to get them is from Right Stuff Anime. I'll put a link in the description.